Hey guys, what is up? Welcome back to the channel. So right now I'm sitting in my Toyota Tacoma, of course, and it's got about 73,000 miles on it. And you all know it's my daily driver and it's also my adventure rig. And if you've been watching my channel, you'll know how I built it up, everything about my ownership, how I maintained it. And you'll probably also know over the last 5 years, I've had very minimal problems with it. Basically what you'd expect with a Toyota, which is great and why I absolutely love this truck. But recently, a couple weeks ago, I started noticing something new: vibrations. Now, before I get too far into this topic, I do want to mention that yes, I have modified my truck. That is no secret. I have lots of videos on basically everything I've done to this truck here on my channel. And that includes things like changing out the suspension, lifting the truck, going to a heavier set of wheels and tires. And I do think any of those things could actually be causing, or really just be like the root of the issue I'm experiencing right now. I'm not sure though, because those are all things I did a while back, and I haven't done anything to this truck recently, at least when I started noticing the vibrations. But anyways, I of course want to address them the best I can today and actually install something that ended up really helping out. So that's what this video is going to be all about. So let's start out by first getting on the road driving so I can kind of show you what I'm talking about. So this is going to be a little bit difficult to show on camera because it's more so something you feel in the steering wheel and a little bit in the floorboards as well. So you can't really see the vibrations on camera. And in my specific case, they aren't actually constant. I feel them at two different speeds. One happens at around 20 to 30 miles an hour. Then once I hit 30, they completely go away. Until I hit 55 or around 60. Then they persist until I'm above 70. Kind of odd, but this seems to be the consistent behavior. So yeah, kind of weird, almost like resonance frequencies of where this occurs. But yeah, it's definitely a feeling here when you're gripping the steering wheel. And again, I want to highlight that these are very slight. Most passengers in my truck don't really feel them unless I tell them about it or they touch the steering wheel. So what I'm doing today to remedy the issue is removing my driver's side CV axle needle bearing and replacing it with this bushing from East Coast Gear Supply. This is what it looks like, and you'll see it in closer detail during my install. But basically, the reason for it is that the thought is, if I understand this correctly, that especially when you have a lifted truck, the CV axle is on an angle, and that's going to put uneven wear on one side of the needle bearing. And that could be the cause of these vibrations. But this bushing is made to a tighter tolerance than the needle bearing and reduces play in the axle. And this is just for the driver's side. The passenger side uses a ball bearing in the Tacoma. So taking a step back, I mentioned that having a lifted Tacoma could potentially accelerate the issue I just described, and my own truck does have a 1.5 inch lift in the front with these Fox Performance Elite Series coilovers I installed a while back, but I personally don't think my CV angle is that extreme. Regardless, the ECGS bushing is the solution I landed on, and here's why. In talking to a lot of people, having others drive the truck too, I actually had a friend, Jake, from Overland Expedition Outfitters, which, by the way, you should check out. They have a lot of really quality gear and parts for your Toyota. Really great builds if you're a Toyota person. But anyways, he recommended this because the thought process was, yeah, maybe it wasn't going to fix the problem, but it wasn't going to hurt, and could be preventative maintenance anyway, so why not try it out? It isn't that expensive, although I will say, not the quickest install for a DIYer, but at least still possible to do at home. So that's why I purchased this, and I'm trying it out today. Now, I do want to mention, I'm not really one to just start throwing a million different parts at a problem, especially with vibrations in these modified or lifted Tacomas. They can be really tricky. I've seen and felt firsthand very different vibrations, like in lifted Tacomas, sometimes people need axle shims because of bad driveline angles to correct them. You also could just have vibrations from things like unbalanced tires. You could also have bad wheel bearings, and I've seen some people's problems get fixed simply after they just grease their drive shaft. Point is, there are a lot of different types of vibrations, a lot of different problems, and it's so easy to just go down the rabbit hole of finding someone's solution and then thinking, oh, that's all I need to do. But really, in reality, not fixing your problem and just fixing something else that didn't need to be fixed, you could end up buying a lot of parts you don't even need. So even if your truck is exhibiting very similar or the same symptoms, I would do a lot of investigation, talk to a lot of different people. I don't want you guys to get the impression that I'm saying this ECGS bushing needs to be installed in your Tacoma, even if it's lifted, but this was simply just the approach that I took. It made the most sense for my situation, and I'm just sharing all that with you today. But anyways, enough talking. Let's get back to my garage so I can show you a step-by-step install of this, and then we'll come back here, drive the truck, and see if it completely solved the problem or not. Alright, so it's time to delete that needle bearing and replace it with this bushing, and as I mentioned, it's from East Coast Gear Supply. So you can just buy the bushing, or there's a kit that comes with an installation and removal tool. Now I opted to get both tools here for ease of install, and after doing this, and as you'll see, I definitely recommend that. And you might also notice I picked up an axle seal, but I didn't end up actually replacing it today because I realized I needed a slide hammer. So I'll have to revisit that at some point, but that is everything you can buy in addition to the bushing itself. And you'll definitely get a little dirty during this install, so glove up. Now this is just a replacement for the driver's side. The passenger side uses a ball bearing, so lift the truck up and remove the wheel and tire from the driver's side. But I also raised the passenger side to put no tension on the sway bar for when we'll need to remove it. The very first step is removing this grease cap, so I took a screwdriver and worked my way around the edges until it popped off. A common thing you'll see in this install is things take longer than Chloe thought, but with enough time and patience, and most importantly, the right tool, you can make it happen. So next up, remove this cotter pin, and note that you'll need to replace that when everything is getting put back together, and take off the spindle nut retainer. Okay, so now the fun part, removing the axle nut, which is tough because it's torqued to 173 foot-pounds, and also, obviously, the rotor spins. So there are several things you could do. If you have a second person, easiest thing is they can be on the brakes. Otherwise, the smarter thing to do here if you're by yourself is wedge a screwdriver in the brake rotor. But you can alternatively do what I did and use a 3-foot breaker bar wedged in between the wheel studs. Although I will say, I didn't think or know about the screwdriver thing, so this method was my solution, and please, if you do this, put the lug nuts back on to protect the threads, unlike me, but it works out. Oh, it's also a 35mm nut, so I actually had to buy a new socket for it. Alright, with that off, I'm disconnecting the sway bar from the spindle using an Allen wrench and ratchet wrench. Then the tie rod end from the spindle as well. And then right where I'm looking at in this clip is where I move my camera to. I'm removing these 2 lower ball joint bolts, and that'll allow us to separate the spindle from the axle. Now it actually hurts me watching this footage because I was stretching out that brake line like this whole video. I'm ashamed about not being more careful about this, so in hindsight, I'm going to tell you guys to look out for that. And I'm not gonna lie, this wasn't my most perfect install ever. There are always hiccups along the way, but I'd rather tell you guys so that if you're following along, hopefully these tidbits will be useful. So yeah, be careful with that brake line, but when the spindle is free, rest it on a jack stand. And then we're on to the most difficult part of this entire install, at least for me, removing the CV from the front diff. It honestly sucked and took so much longer, and in reality is a lot harder than what I'm showing here on camera. That's the magic of editing, but in reality it took a long time for me. I mean, the first thing I ran into was my TRD front skid was in the way, so I just removed it. And there are techniques to approaching how to remove this thing, but what I was doing for quite literally an hour was hitting these notches on the axle to try to pry it out of the front diff. Now, doing research on this, I've seen other people use a big swing hammer and a cable, and that seems to work out well rather than doing what I was doing, which was very brute force, but definitely share your tips in the comments section. Another thing that might be helpful is kind of moving some stuff out of the way. Having a small space to work did not make this the easiest thing ever, but eventually that axle comes out. And finally, there's the needle bearing we've been trying to get to. Now clean up some of that front diff fluid, and everyone doing this install recommends putting a shop towel into the diff because you'll see in a second, the bearing removal tool has a small piece and you don't want to lose that in the front diff. So when you've blocked it off, with a set of needle nose pliers, I'm taking that piece, or really this plate, and I'm struggling, but the goal is to get it to sit straight behind the bearing. It's just that the tolerance was kind of tight, and at one point I considered just shaving it down ever so slightly for more clearance, but just trying to shove it in with the needle nose pliers also works too. The next part is simple because you just thread the rod and then tighten because the nut pulls against the plate to pull that needle bearing out. And now, with the needle bearing out, we're basically halfway there. Now looking at mine, yes, it's damaged. You can see there's a missing chunk of metal here, but this, I would have to imagine, was actually from the removal tool itself because it's pretty much the exact same size. Otherwise, to me, the condition of my own needle bearing didn't look terrible, but it's hard to tell with things sometimes visually, especially if you don't have a super trained eye. So here, I was just curious if I could see if I could feel more play with the needle bearing on my axle and less with the ECGS bushing. And I think to a degree I did, although there was no going back now anyways because the needle bearing was broken. So yeah, when I got back into it, first up, before anything else, I removed that shop towel. Do not forget that. And then I'm installing the ECGS bushing using the install tool, which is machined to be the exact depth you need to press that bushing in. The only real thing I'll emphasize here for you guys is that you need to make sure the bushing is going on straight. Took me a couple tries to do that, and from there on out, it is pretty easy. It just takes time to fully get it in, but this is what it should look like. And with that in, we're in the home stretch because now it's just a matter of putting everything back together in the reverse order. So the axle goes back, which is much easier than taking it out. And again, when you're putting that spindle back on, please watch your brake line and be way more cautious than I was. At this point, I was hours deep into this install. It was taking way longer than I anticipated, but I guess that's how it always goes. But I do remember in this moment, I was very happy knowing that all the hard stuff was pretty much over. So as I'm putting everything back on, I am torquing. So the tie rod end to the spindle with the castle nut is 67 foot-pounds. Where the sway bar connects to the spindle is 52 foot-pounds. And that axle nut is 174 foot-pounds. So you'll have lost some diff fluid from this install, and based on what I saw in my own drain pan, I knew I should refill, so that's what I did. I was actually due for a change anyway, so I just drained the whole thing and refilled. And whenever I do this, I always like using the oil that comes in the pouches rather than the pump like I have in the past. That's just my preference. And then I always just fill until I start to see some gear oil overflow a bit like this. So with that done, and now at this point we are truly done, put the wheel and tire back on. Lower the truck, obviously torque your lug nuts, 83 foot-pounds in the Tacoma, and toss that old needle bearing aside because now the delete is done. But the million-dollar question is, how are the vibrations now? So after installing and driving, I think this definitely had a positive effect on my whole vibration issue. So you know how I was talking about this lower speed vibration? This one seems like it's completely gone. I don't feel it anymore in the steering wheel. However, as I speed up and get into the 60s over here, I still do feel a little bit of a vibration, but it definitely feels reduced compared to before. But once again, it's like right when I hit 70, it feels like it's completely gone. In driving in four-wheel drive, the problem still persists. I do notice though, when I get on like a ramp on the highway and make a left turn, it goes away, so maybe it's a hub? Although I didn't feel much play on either side, so I'm not 100% sure. Again, it's definitely better, but something is still there. So I still have some investigation to do, and I think there's going to be a part 2 to this video of just further diagnosing this, but I am so glad I installed this. I can vouch for this part. I really like that it's not that expensive and it wasn't relatively that difficult to do either. So I think it's worth at least looking into, putting on your radar if you're having similar issues. Again though, vibrations can be very difficult and can be coming from a lot of different things. Whatever the case, I hope you guys found this video either useful or interesting. Let me know what you think, and I appreciate you guys watching to the end. If you want to connect more with me, you can follow me on my Instagram. It is at ChloeKuo Taco. I post more on there in real time, but other than that, I hope I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.